The weathered for sale sign on Hillcrest Farm had faded to near illegibility after 3 years of Montana sun and snow. Local real estate agent Dan Miller had stopped bothering to show the property entirely. 240 acres of rocky, inhospitable land that wouldn't grow enough to feed a family of rabbits, let alone turn a profit. So when Rebecca Mitchell inherited the worthless property from her estranged uncle, the residents of Riverdale offered condolences rather than congratulations. What no one realized was that beneath the barren topsoil of Hillcrest Farm lay a mineral deposit that would not only transform Rebecca's life, but put her on a collision course with Harrison Wells, the powerful CEO of NorthStar Mining, the same man who had forced her uncle into bankruptcy and exile 30 years earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The endless Montana sky stretched blue and vast above Hillcrest Farm as Rebecca "Becky" Mitchell stood at the crest of the property's eastern ridge, the late April wind whipping strands of chestnut hair across her face. At 38, Becky carried herself with the quiet resilience of someone who had weathered both personal and financial storms, her practical work boots and well-worn jeans telling the story of a woman who chose substance over appearance. Below her, the 240 acres of Hillcrest Farm spread out in a patchwork of dusty fields, scrubby vegetation, and rocky outcroppings that had defied generations of farmers who attempted to coax crops from its stubborn soil. The dilapidated farmhouse and trio of listing barns stood as monuments to failed dreams, their weathered timbers silvered by decades of harsh seasons. "Well, Uncle Frank," Becky murmured to the empty air, "what exactly am I supposed to do with this?" 6 months after her uncle's death, the inheritance had come as a complete surprise. Frank Mitchell had left Riverdale when Becky was just 8 years old, driven away by financial ruin and whispered scandals. The few childhood memories she had of him were of a quiet man with calloused hands who taught her to identify the rocks and minerals that studded the Montana landscape, knowledge that had sparked her interest in geology before practical concerns had steered her toward agriculture. "You sure you want to accept this inheritance, Becky?" asked County Clerk Harold Jenkins, leaning against his pickup truck. The older man's expression conveyed equal parts pity and concern as he handed her the final paperwork and keys to the property. "County's been trying to auction this place for back taxes for years. Nothing but rattlesnakes and bitter memories out here." "I'm sure," Becky replied, her voice carrying a certainty that belied her private doubts. "It's still land, Harold. 240 acres is 240 acres. "It's your funeral," Harold shrugged, climbing back into his truck. "Though what a woman who's already got productive farmland over in Stone Creek wants with this god-forsaken patch is beyond me." As the county clerk's truck disappeared in a cloud of dust, Becky climbed back into her faded blue pickup and continued her survey of her unexpected inheritance. The property had been abandoned for nearly 3 years after the last tenant farmer had given up, leaving behind broken equipment and deteriorating structures that would require significant investment. To resurrect, Becky's decision to accept the inheritance had raised eyebrows throughout Riverdale, where she was known as a practical, methodical farmer who had transformed her small 60-acre vegetable operation in neighboring Stone Creek into a profitable business through innovation and sheer determination. Why would such a sensible woman waste time and resources on Hillcrest Farm? The answer lay not in the present condition of the property, but in a childhood promise and nagging questions about her uncle's abrupt departure from the community 3 decades earlier. Uncle Frank had been more than just her mother's brother. He had been the one person who encouraged Becky's fascination with the natural world, spending hours teaching her to identify minerals and fossils during his infrequent visits. "This land speaks if you know how to listen," he had told her during their last walk together, shortly before his disappearance from her life. Remember that, Firefly. Sometimes what looks worthless on the surface holds the greatest treasures. Those words had stayed with Becky through college, where she had initially pursued geology before financial reality forced a pivot to agricultural science. When the notification of inheritance had arrived, those words had resurfaced, along with questions that had never been answered about why a respected local farmer had suddenly sold his prime agricultural land and moved to a remote corner of Idaho, where he had lived in modest circumstances until his death. As Becky approached the farmhouse, her practical assessment couldn't ignore the sagging porch, missing shingles, and windows boarded after the last winter's storms. Inside, the musty rooms held sparse furniture draped in dust-covered sheets, abandoned by the last tenant. In what had once been the kitchen, a calendar from 2019 still hung beside a faded photograph of the farm in better days. Becky moved methodically through the house, cataloging damage and mentally calculating repairs. Her phone rang, breaking the eerie silence. "How's the disaster property?" asked Maria Diaz, her farm manager back in Stone Creek after running through updates on their primary operation. Maria had been the most vocal critic of Becky's decision to accept the inheritance, her practical nature recoiling at what seemed a sentimental waste of resources. "Less disastrous than expected," Becky replied, stepping onto the back porch to escape the stifling interior. "The main house needs serious work, but the bones are solid. One of the barns might be salvageable." "And the land itself?" Maria pressed, knowing that no amount of salvageable buildings could justify the investment if the soil wasn't viable. Becky's gaze swept across the barren landscape. "It's been neglected, but that doesn't mean it's dead. I'm going to check the soil composition and water sources next. Just remember, we've got the farmers' market season starting in 3 weeks," Maria reminded her. "We need you back to finalize the planting schedule and delivery routes." "I'll be back tomorrow," Becky assured her. "This is just a preliminary assessment." After ending the call, Becky retrieved her soil testing kit and geological survey equipment from her truck. While her neighbors saw her simply as a successful small-scale farmer, her 2 years of geology studies and subsequent agricultural science degree had given her skills beyond typical cultivation. Her interest in Hillcrest Farm wasn't just sentimental. There were aspects of its abandonment that had never made sense to her scientifically. The afternoon sun tracked across the sky as Becky methodically checked soil samples from various locations across the property. The results confirmed what everyone in Riverdale already believed. The topsoil was poor, rocky, and would require significant amendment to support traditional crops. But it was the samples from the rocky eastern ridge that captured her attention. The soil composition there was markedly different, with unusual mineral content that triggered memories from her geology courses. As she collected additional samples from the ridge, Becky noticed peculiar dark streaks in the soil and rock fragments that didn't match typical Montana ranchland geology. More intriguing was the old quarry cut into the side of the ridge, long, abandoned, but showing signs of being more than just a source of building stone. The methodical cuts and exploratory channels suggested a more targeted extraction effort than would be typical for simple construction materials. As Becky labeled her samples with precise location data, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle pulled her attention from her work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Shielding her eyes against the late afternoon glare, she spotted a black SUV with tinted windows, navigating the rutted dirt road to the farmhouse. The vehicle's gleaming exterior and city license plate seemed comically out of place in the rural setting. The SUV came to a stop beside her truck, kicking up a cloud of dust that swirled in the golden afternoon light. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s, her tailored business suit as incongruous with the desolate landscape as her vehicle. "Ms. Mitchell," the woman called, approaching with confidence despite her impractical footwear. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, acquisitions specialist for NorthStar Mining. I was hoping to catch you here." Becky accepted the extended handshake with measured caution. "I didn't realize news traveled that fast. I've only officially owned this place for about 5 hours." Jennifer's polite smile didn't reach her eyes. "In my business, information about property transactions is valuable, particularly when those properties are of interest to my employers." And why would NorthStar Mining be interested in 240 acres of what everyone assures me is worthless farmland? Becky asked, her tone casual despite the sudden alertness she felt. "May I be frank, Ms. Mitchell?" She didn't wait for permission. NorthStar is planning a major regional survey project. The most logical base of operations would be this property, given its central location to our areas of interest. Becky absorbed this information with outward calm that masked her racing thoughts. NorthStar Mining was the region's largest resource extraction company, having expanded dramatically under the leadership of Harrison Wells, the same businessman whose aggressive land acquisition strategies had reshaped the economic landscape of several rural Montana communities over the past 3 decades. "We're prepared to make a generous offer," Jennifer continued, misinterpreting Becky's silence as negotiation tactics. $50,000, more than fair market value given the property's condition and agricultural limitations. A substantial return on a property you've inherited at no cost. The unexpected offer confirmed Becky's suspicion that something larger was at play. No corporation offered well above market value without compelling reason, especially for land widely considered worthless. "That's certainly generous," she replied carefully, "but I'm not looking to sell. I have specific plans for this property." Jennifer's professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing momentary frustration before she recovered. "Perhaps if you shared your plans, we could discuss how NorthStar might help facilitate them elsewhere. $50,000 could secure considerably more promising land in the county." "My plans are tied to this specific property," Becky stated simply, "but I appreciate NorthStar's interest. If I reconsider, you'll be my first call." The finality in her tone was unmistakable. Jennifer handed her a business card with a practiced smile that didn't mask her disappointment. "Please do think it over, Ms. Mitchell. This offer won't remain open indefinitely. The project has certain timelines that require prompt resolution." As the black SUV disappeared down the dirt road, kicking up dust that glowed orange in the setting sun, Becky's mind worked through the implications of this unexpected visit. Why would a massive mining corporation send a representative hours after her inheritance was finalized? The proposed survey project explained their interest superficially, but not the urgency or the inflated offer. Becky returned to the soil, samples she'd collected, examining them more carefully in light of NorthStar's interest. The unusual composition near the old quarry took on new significance. She packed the samples carefully in her truck, planning to have them analyzed properly when she returned to State University, where she maintained connections in the geology department. Rather than drive back to Stone Creek that evening, Becky decided to spend the night on the property. She unrolled her sleeping bag in the bed of her pickup, the farmhouse being too dilapidated for comfortable shelter, and lay beneath the vast canopy of stars that only truly revealed themselves far from city lights. As coyotes called in the distance and the temperature dropped with typical Montana evening swiftness, Becky contemplated the day's events. NorthStar's urgent interest suggested the land held value beyond what was visible on the surface. Combined with the unusual soil composition she'd observed and the peculiar history of her uncle's abrupt departure, a theory began to form in her mind, one that would require expert confirmation. Dawn broke with the harsh clarity unique to high country mornings. Becky rose with the sun, performed a final circuit of the property to confirm her observations from the previous day, then headed to Montana State University with her soil samples, and a growing sense that her unexpected inheritance might prove more significant than anyone had imagined. Her first stop was not her old department, but the office of Dr. James Cooper in the geology department. The professor had been her advisor during her brief geology studies and had maintained a friendly relationship despite her change of academic direction. "Becky Mitchell," Jim greeted her with genuine warmth, rising from behind a desk cluttered with rock specimens and academic papers. "What brings you back to these hallowed halls? Finally decided to abandon tomatoes for metamorphic formations?" "Not exactly," Becky smiled, placing her carefully labeled containers on his desk. "But I do need your expert opinion on some samples from Hillcrest Farm in Riverdale." Jim's eyebrows rose. "Frank Mitchell's old place? What's your interest there?" "I inherited it," Becky explained, noting his surprise. "My Uncle Frank was my mother's brother." "I never made that connection," Jim admitted, examining the sample. "Containers with professional interest. That property has quite a reputation in geological circles, you know." This casual comment captured Becky's full attention. "What kind of reputation?" Jim's expression grew thoughtful as he began preliminary examination of the soil samples. There were rumors in the early 90s about a mineral survey that showed promising results, but everything went quiet suddenly. "Your uncle sold to a holding company and left the area, if I recall correctly." "A holding company?" Becky asked, this detail new to her. "Do you know which one?" "Blue Ridge Properties, I believe," Jim replied, his attention now fully engaged by the microscopic examination of her samples. Though there was speculation it was a shell for NorthStar Mining, which was just beginning its expansion in the region back then. The connection to NorthStar crystallized the theory forming in Becky's mind. "NorthStar sent someone to see me yesterday, just hours after I finalized the inheritance. Offered me $50,000 for the property, claiming they need it for a survey project base." Jim's hands stilled over the samples, his scientific curiosity fully engaged. "Did they indeed? Let me run some tests. If NorthStar's interested, there might be more to these samples than agricultural potential." While Jim worked, Becky called Maria to check on operations at her Stone Creek farm and brief her about the developments at Hillcrest. Her farm manager remained skeptical, but was intrigued by NorthStar's unexpected interest. "Even if it is just about a convenient location for their operations," Maria reasoned, "you could use that money to install the new irrigation system we've been planning." "True," Becky acknowledged. "But why would they offer so much for land that's publicly valued at next to nothing? And why the urgency?" By mid-afternoon, Jim called her back to his laboratory with preliminary results that confirmed Becky's suspicions. "Your soil samples show significant rare earth element concentrations," he explained, professional excitement evident in his voice. "Particularly neodymium and dysprosium, critical components for renewable energy technology and electric vehicles." "How significant?" Becky asked, struggling to maintain her composure. "Significant enough to explain NorthStar's interest if they've done satellite spectral imaging of the area," Jim replied. "These elements are increasingly valuable as green technology expands. The US currently imports over 80% of its rare earth elements from China, so domestic sources are becoming strategically important." The confirmation sent Becky's mind racing through possibilities and implications. If the seemingly worthless Land she'd inherited contained valuable mineral deposits. Her uncle's sudden departure from Riverdale 30 years ago took on new significance. What would be the next step to confirm these findings? Becky asked, practical considerations temporarily, overriding emotional implications. More extensive geological testing, Jim replied. I can arrange for some graduate students to help with core samples if you're interested. Though once NorthStar realizes you're conducting tests, they'll know you're aware of the potential value. The following morning, Becky returned to Hillcrest Farm with Jim and two of his graduate students, equipped with more sophisticated geological testing equipment than her basic kit could provide. As they set up near the old quarry, a familiar county vehicle appeared on the access road. Sheriff Mike Daniels approached with the unhurried gait of someone with both official business and personal curiosity. Bringing in the experts already, I see, he observed, nodding toward Jim and the equipment. Word around town is that NorthStar Mining is mighty interested in your inheritance. News travels fast, Becky commented, not entirely surprised in a county where significant developments were few and far between. Especially when Harrison Wells himself shows up at the county records office asking about your deed transfer, Sheriff Daniels replied, the casual delivery belying the significance of this information. Not often the CEO of NorthStar takes personal interest in a property transaction. This detail heightened Becky's suspicions further. The CEO's direct involvement suggested the property held importance beyond a mere convenient location for operations. Any idea why he'd take such interest? Becky asked, watching the sheriff's reaction carefully. Sheriff Daniels studied her for a moment before responding. There have been stories about Hillcrest Farm for years, prospectors with equipment appearing and disappearing overnight. Unusual vehicles parked on County Road 22 with surveying equipment. Never any public announcements. He gestured toward the equipment Jim was calibrating. Seems you might be about to discover what they've been looking for. After the sheriff departed, Jim completed his survey of the area, his expression growing increasingly animated as the data accumulated on his laptop. By early afternoon, he turned the computer toward Becky with an unmistakable look of excitement. These readings strongly suggest a significant rare earth element deposit, he explained, indicating patterns on the geological imaging display. The formation extends at least 300 feet below surface level and appears to cover approximately 60 acres in the eastern section of your property. The scientific confirmation transformed abstract suspicion into concrete reality. The land Becky had inherited offered the possibility of extraordinary value. More importantly, it explained the urgent interest from NorthStar Mining and raised profound questions about whether Harrison Wells had known about this potential when her uncle had sold the property under mysterious circumstances 3 decades earlier. As Becky and Jim packed up the equipment, another vehicle approached. Not a county sheriff's SUV or Jennifer Walsh's corporate vehicle, but a gleaming black Mercedes that projected power and wealth in every sleek line. Becky somehow knew who had come to visit her newly acquired property. Harrison Wells exited the vehicle with the confident authority of someone unaccustomed to obstacles. At 62, the CEO of NorthStar Mining carried himself with the precise blend of charm and intimidation that had built his company into a regional powerhouse. His tailored suit and manicured appearance seemed absurdly out of place amid the rural desolation, yet he moved with the assurance of someone who considered all territory ultimately his domain. Ms. Mitchell, he greeted Becky with practiced cordiality that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. I see you've been quite busy with your new acquisition. His gaze swept over the survey equipment and lingered on Jim with barely concealed displeasure before returning to Becky. Finding anything interesting? Interesting enough that the CEO of NorthStar Mining Makes a personal visit? Becky replied evenly. That's quite a step up from your acquisition specialist. Wells's smile remained in place, though his eyes hardened slightly at Becky's directness. Jennifer mentioned you were attached to this particular property. I thought a more personal approach might be appropriate. He gestured toward the expanse of seemingly barren land. I understand sentiment, Ms. Mitchell. Family legacies matter, even those that ended abruptly. The deliberate reference to the historic connection between their families confirmed what Becky had begun to suspect. Wells knew exactly who he was dealing with. Sentiment is part of it, Becky acknowledged. But I'm also curious why NorthStar Mining is so interested in land that's supposedly worthless. A convenient base of operations is hardly worthless to a mining company, Wells countered smoothly, and I'm prepared to increase our offer to $100,000 in recognition of your family's historical connection to this property. The significant escalation of the offer crystallized Becky's suspicions more effectively than any geological survey could have. And if I told you Dr. Cooper here believes there might be rare earth elements under this worthless land? For a brief moment, Wells's composed facade cracked, a flicker of calculation and concern crossing his features before the confident mask returned. Speculation based on preliminary survey equipment would be a risky basis for turning down a guaranteed return, he recovered. Mineral extraction requires permits, equipment, regulatory compliance, millions in investment with no certainty of results. Yet NorthStar seems willing to pay well above market value to acquire this specific property, Becky observed. That suggests your company has information beyond what's publicly available. Wells studied her with new intensity, reassessing the farmer he had clearly underestimated. I'll be direct, Ms. Mitchell. NorthStar conducted satellite surveys of this region 2 years ago. The results suggested potential deposits worth investigating. The most promising indicators were on this property. The same property that once belonged to my uncle before he suddenly sold it and left the community, Becky noted, the historical connection suddenly taking on new significance. Ancient history, Wells dismissed with a wave of his hand. Business decisions from another era. My interest is purely in current opportunities. He paused, recalibrating his approach. $150,000, Ms. Mitchell. Final offer, contingent on immediate acceptance. The escalation from $50,000 to $150,000 in the space of a single conversation told Becky everything she needed to know about the potential value hidden beneath this supposedly worthless land. I think I'll hold on to it for now, she replied calmly. See what my own exploration reveals. Wells' expression hardened, the pretense of friendly negotiation evaporating. Individual landowners rarely have the resources to properly develop mineral discoveries, Ms. Mitchell. The costs of extraction, processing, regulatory compliance, they're prohibitive for someone in your position. Perhaps, Becky acknowledged, but I have something you apparently want quite badly. That creates options I didn't have yesterday. As Wells returned to his vehicle, the tension in his posture revealed the failed negotiation had unsettled him more than he wanted to show. Before departing, he turned back with one final comment. Consider carefully before you proceed, Ms. Mitchell. Mineral exploration is a complex business with many potential complications, particularly for newcomers. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air as the Mercedes pulled away, leaving Becky and Jim in contemplative silence. The confrontation had confirmed their suspicions while simultaneously raising the stakes beyond what either had anticipated. He's worried, Jim observed after Wells' vehicle disappeared from view. Really worried, judging by that offer and the barely veiled threat, and the fact that he came himself instead of sending more representatives. Becky agreed. The question is exactly how valuable is what's under this land, and what does NorthStar know that we don't? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the property that had suddenly become the center of an unexpected power struggle, Becky knew that her simple quest to understand her uncle's legacy had evolved into something far more significant. The worthless farm, inherited through family connection, now represented not just potential wealth, but a chance to balance historical injustice and perhaps uncover truth that had remained buried for half a century. What neither Becky nor Harrison Wells could have anticipated was how quickly events would escalate, nor the shocking discoveries that lay not just beneath the rocky soil of Hillcrest Farm, but in the forgotten records of a past that would soon return to change everything. The university laboratory at Montana State fell silent as Dr. Jim Cooper completed his presentation of the comprehensive geological analysis. The projector cast a blue glow across the faces of Becky, Maria, and Sarah Thompson, the small-town attorney Becky had brought in for legal guidance. Based on these core samples and spectrographic analysis, we're looking at a rare earth element deposit of approximately 23,000 metric tons, conservatively valued at over $112 million at current market prices, Jim said, turning to Becky, whose stoic expression masked her internal shock. And that's just in the eastern 60 acres we've tested. The formation likely extends further. The room fell into stunned silence as the magnitude of the discovery settled over them. Maria, who had driven up from Stone Creek that morning, let out a low whistle. "And NorthStar offered you $150,000 for this?" she asked, incredulity evident in her voice. "Less than 0.1% of its potential value," Sarah noted, the attorney's expression sharpening with professional interest. "That raises serious questions about what they knew and when they knew it." 3 weeks had passed since Becky's confrontation with Harrison Wells on the dusty soil of Hillcrest Farm. Those weeks had been a whirlwind of activity as she leveraged every professional connection and resource at her disposal to understand exactly what lay beneath her. Inheritance. The day after Wells's visit, Becky had met with Sarah Thompson in the modest law office that served most of Riverdale's farming community. The attorney had been her mother's friend and had handled the transfer of the Hillcrest inheritance. "Let me get this straight," Sarah had said, leaning back in her worn leather chair. "You inherited an abandoned farm, and the next day, the CEO of NorthStar Mining personally offered you $150,000 for it. Jim Cooper's ground-penetrating radar shows geological formations consistent with significant rare earth element deposits," Becky confirmed, and Wells essentially admitted their satellite surveys identified the same thing 2 years ago. Sarah whistled softly. If NorthStar's internal valuation justified a $150,000 offer on day one, we're talking about potential worth far beyond that. She leaned forward, her expression serious. "But Becky, developing a mineral discovery requires resources beyond what most individual landowners can access." Wells wasn't wrong about that. "I'm not looking to become a mining magnate," Becky replied. "But I need to understand the full value of what I'm sitting on before making any decisions, and I need legal protection while I figure it out." Sarah had nodded, immediately grasping the implied threat in Wells' parting words. "I'll file for mineral rights confirmation with the state registry and get a cease and desist order, preventing any unauthorized access to your property. We should also look into the history of that land more carefully, particularly the circumstances under which your uncle sold it." That conversation had set in motion a dual investigation, scientific assessment of the mineral deposit and historical examination of the property's complicated past. For the scientific work, Jim had assembled a small team of experts willing to work discreetly, using the university's resources, supplemented by specialized equipment borrowed from the State Geological Survey Office. The historical investigation had proven equally revealing, though in ways neither Becky nor Sarah had anticipated. The county archives contain some interesting discrepancies regarding the 1991 sale, Sarah reported during their second meeting. The purchase price your uncle received was substantially below market value, even for agricultural land at that time, and there are irregularities in the transfer documentation. Blue Ridge Properties, the purchasing entity, was indeed a shell company that dissolved 6 months after acquiring the property, at which point Hillcrest Farm transferred to another holding company, Pinnacle Investments. "Let me guess," Becky had said. "Pinnacle was also connected to NorthStar." "Not directly," Sarah replied, "but to Harrison Wells personally. He was the sole registered agent. The property changed hands twice more through similar entities before ending up with the tenant farmer, who eventually abandoned it when agricultural operations proved unsustainable. Each transfer occurred at prices well below market value, as if the purpose was simply to obscure the original transaction and connection." This historical context added layers to Becky's increasingly complex situation. What had begun as an unexpected inheritance now represented both potential fortune and possible historical injustice. Now, 3 weeks later, the scientific assessment had reached its preliminary conclusion in the university conference room, where Jim presented his findings to Becky, Maria, and Sarah. $112 million, Maria repeated, the number clearly difficult to process. For land everyone considered worthless. Minimum valuation, Jim corrected. The deposit could be substantially larger. Which explains Wells' increasingly aggressive tactics, Sarah added grimly. She slid a document across the table to Becky. NorthStar filed a petition yesterday challenging the inheritance process. They're claiming your uncle was not of sound mind when he drafted his will, and that there are unnamed other interested parties with prior claim to the property. They won't win on those grounds, Becky said with confidence that surprised the others. I spoke with Uncle Frank by phone just a month before he passed. His mind was as sharp as ever. Sarah nodded. Agreed. But legal merit isn't always the point with these maneuvers. They're trying to cloud your title and create uncertainty while applying pressure from multiple angles. Like the environmental assessment they tried to force last week, Maria asked. And the sudden county road access survey, Becky added. Every day brings some new official with paperwork that somehow involves accessing my property. Classic corporate pressure tactics, Sarah confirmed. They're hoping you'll decide the legal hassle isn't worth it and accept their offer, which I'm guessing will increase significantly now that Dr. Cooper has confirmed the deposit's value. Becky's phone vibrated with an incoming text from Sheriff Daniels. NorthStar trucks heading toward Hillcrest. Odd. Said they have survey permission from county. Thought you should know. We need to get out there, Becky said, showing the others the message. They're making a move. The drive to Hillcrest Farm took 40 minutes at speeds that stretched rural highway safety margins. As they approached the access road, they spotted 2 white trucks with NorthStar Mining logos parked near the gate, which now sported a brand new chain and padlock, different from the one Becky had installed. Sheriff Daniels' patrol car was already on scene, the older man standing between the corporate vehicles and the gate with the patient stance of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. Afternoon, Becky, the sheriff greeted as they pulled up. These gentlemen seem to have misunderstood county access regulations. 3 men in NorthStar uniform stood near their trucks, equipment cases visible in the open truck beds. The apparent leader stepped forward with professional confidence that faltered slightly at Sarah's appearance. Ms. Mitchell, I presume? I'm David Weber, Senior Geological Technician for NorthStar Mining. He held up an official-looking document. We have county authorization to conduct environmental assessment along the proposed access road that crosses this property. Sarah intercepted the document before Becky could respond. This is a general environmental survey permit for county roads and public easements, she observed after quick review. It doesn't authorize access to private property without owner consent. Weber's confident expression wavered further. The county administrator assured us this permit covered necessary access. The county administrator doesn't have authority to grant access to private property, Sheriff Daniels interrupted mildly. Something I explained when I found these gentlemen cutting your lock, Becky. You cut my lock? Becky asked, her normally calm demeanor showing rare signs of anger. We replaced it with a new one, Weber offered weakly, holding out a key. We were instructed to secure the site after conducting our survey. Instructed by whom? Sarah pressed. Weber's hesitation spoke volumes. Our operations supervisor relayed instructions from management. Let me guess, Becky said, management being Harrison Wells himself. The technician's uncomfortable shift was confirmation enough. Sarah handed the permit back with practiced professionalism that didn't mask her satisfaction. Please inform Mr. Wells that unauthorized access to this property constitutes criminal trespass. Any future attempts will result in immediate legal action against both the individuals involved and NorthStar Mining as a corporate entity. As the NorthStar employees retreated to their vehicles, Sheriff Daniels cut off the unauthorized lock and replaced it with Becky's original. They're getting desperate, he observed. Switching from legal maneuvers to direct action suggests they're running out of patience or time, or both. The question is why now? What's changed in their timeline? Sarah wondered. The answer arrived the following morning in the form of a regional business newsletter that featured a small announcement. NorthStar Mining finalizes arrangements for Green Technology Minerals Initiative. Production to begin within 90 days. That's their pressure point, Sarah observed when Becky showed her the article. They've committed to production schedules with suppliers in the renewable energy sector. Without access to your rare earth elements, they'd have to source materials internationally at significantly higher cost, jeopardizing the contracts they've already signed. And no wonder Wells is getting aggressive, Becky added, the pieces falling into place. This gives us leverage, but also increases risk. A corporation facing deadline pressure has motivation to pursue all available options, legal and otherwise. The attorney's warning proved prescient when Jennifer Walsh appeared at Becky's Stone Creek farm later that afternoon, this time accompanied by NorthStar's chief legal counsel, Gregory Phillips, a silver-haired corporate attorney with a reputation for aggressive negotiation. Ms. Mitchell, in light of recent developments, NorthStar Mining is prepared to make a final offer of $1.5 million for immediate transfer of the Hillcrest Farm property, Phillips stated with cold efficiency. This represents our absolute maximum valuation, considering all relevant factors. The tenfold increase from Wells' personal offer confirmed the corporation's growing desperation. Becky maintained a composed exterior despite the staggering sum, an amount that would transform her farming operation and secure her financial future beyond anything she had imagined possible from her inheritance. "And if I decline?" Becky asked, curious about their prepared response. Philip's expression hardened. "Then we proceed with all available legal remedies to resolve our prior claim to the mineral rights on that property. I should note that access road construction operations on adjacent properties will continue indefinitely under our existing permits. The impact on local agricultural activities would be unfortunate but necessary." The threat was barely veiled. "Accept our offer, or we'll make life unbearable for you and your neighbors while fighting you through every legal channel available." "I'll need time to consider an offer of this magnitude," Becky replied. revealing nothing of her actual reaction to either the amount or the implied threat. "You have 48 hours, Phillips stated flatly. "After that, the offer expires permanently, and we pursue alternative approaches to securing our interests." After they departed, Maria voiced what everyone was thinking. Wonders. $5 million would transform everything we're trying to do here. We could upgrade every system on Stone Creek, expand operations, implement all the sustainability projects we've been planning for years, and let Wells complete what he started with my uncle, Becky responded quietly, taking land through manipulation and pressure, knowing it contains value far beyond what's being offered. "It's your decision," Maria acknowledged. "But $1. $5 million is life-changing money for an inheritance you never expected." The following morning brought an unexpected development when Diane Harper from the State Attorney General's office arrived unannounced at Becky's farm. "Ms. Mitchell, our office has been investigating NorthStar Mining for potential violations of state mineral rights regulations and improper influence over county officials," Harper explained after introducing herself. "Your recent interactions with the company have intersected with our ongoing investigation. I've had some unusual experiences with them since inheriting Hillcrest Farm," Becky acknowledged cautiously. "So I've heard," Harper replied. "Sheriff Daniels contacted our office after yesterday's trespassing incident, which appears to connect to other patterns we've been monitoring." She removed a file from her briefcase. "Are you aware that the county administrator who authorized NorthStar's environmental survey permit has received substantial consulting fees from NorthStar subsidiaries over the past 2 years?" Becky exchanged glances with Sarah, whose expression suggested this was new information to her as well. "I wasn't aware of that connection." "We've been building a case concerning NorthStar's methods of securing mineral rights throughout the state," Harper continued. "Your situation represents a particularly clear example of their escalating tactics when conventional approaches fail." The conversation that followed revealed an investigation far broader than Becky's individual property dispute. NorthStar's aggressive expansion under Harrison Wells had apparently involved systematic efforts to influence local officials, manipulate permit processes, and pressure reluctant landowners through questionable means. "We believe your property represents special importance to NorthStar beyond simple mineral access," Harper concluded after outlining the broader investigation. "Their response to your inheritance has been disproportionate to typical acquisition negotiations." "I might have insight into why," Becky replied after brief consideration. She explained the rare earth element discovery and the historical documents suggesting Wells's knowledge of potential deposits before the 1991 purchase from her uncle. Diane Harper's professional demeanor couldn't entirely mask her excitement at this new information. "This adds significant dimension to our investigation. Would you be willing to share copies of these geological findings and historical land transfer records?" Noddy, after the prosecutor departed, with copies of both the historical records and Jim's preliminary findings, Sheriff Daniels, who had been present during the meeting, lingered behind. "You just escalated this situation beyond anything Wells will be prepared for," he observed. "The AG's office has been looking for leverage against NorthStar for years. You just handed them a case with both historical and current implications." "I didn't start this fight," Becky replied, "but I won't back down from it either." "Just watch your back," the sheriff advised. "Wells won't take this lying down." The warning proved prophetic the very next morning when Becky awoke to urgent calls from 3 neighboring farmers. Overnight, NorthStar had secured emergency permits to test water quality in the aquifer serving the entire agricultural region. Permits that authorized immediate drilling operations within 500 feet of Becky's property line. By noon, massive drilling equipment had been positioned on adjacent properties, with operations running 24 hours under emergency authorization. The official explanation involved potential contamination concerns, but the strategic positioning made the actual purpose clear. NorthStar was attempting to access the mineral deposit from neighboring properties while creating continuous disruption for Becky. "They can't directly extract your minerals from adjacent land," Sarah explained during an emergency meeting at Becky's farm. "That would constitute mineral theft under state law, but they can make your life miserable with round-the-clock operations, while collecting additional geological data about the deposit's boundaries. And intimidating my neighbors," Becky added. "3 have already called, asking if I shouldn't just sell and end the disruption." "Classic pressure tactics," Sarah acknowledged grimly. "They're trying to isolate you while gathering more information about exactly what they're fighting for." The situation escalated further that afternoon when Thomas Reeves, NorthStar's environmental assessment manager, requested a private meeting with Becky away from both properties. They met at a diner in a neighboring town, where Reeves's nervous demeanor contrasted sharply with the corporate confidence Becky had observed in other NorthStar representatives. "I've been with NorthStar for 27 years, Reeves began, without preamble. "Started when Harrison's father was still running things. What's happening now crosses lines that shouldn't be crossed." "What kinds of lines?" Becky asked, studying the man carefully. "I was part of the original assessment team that surveyed your uncle's property in 1990, Reeves admitted. "We found the rare earth deposit and reported it to management, but the official report was altered before being filed with the state. The public document showed nothing of value, while the internal version identified a significant find." Becky's suspicions about her uncle's abrupt departure crystallized with this confirmation. "They pressured my uncle to sell based on false information." Reeves nodded grimly. "Your uncle was told the land had no mineral value, but that NorthStar needed the agricultural acreage for equipment staging. When he resisted the initial offer, other pressures were applied. His farm loan was suddenly called in. Local suppliers were discouraged from doing business with him, and there were suggestions that environmental violations would be found if inspectors looked closely at his property. The tactics were disturbingly similar to what Becky herself had been experiencing, separated by 3 decades, but connected by the same corporate entity and leadership. "Why are you telling me this now?" Becky asked. "Because what was unethical, but technically legal 30 years ago, has evolved into something that's neither," Reeves replied. "Wells is attempting to secure minerals that legally belong to you, using tactics that have become increasingly questionable. The falsified county permits, the manufactured environmental emergency, the pressure on your neighbors, they've crossed into potentially criminal territory. Do you have documentation of any of this?" Reeves slid a USB drive across the table. "These are the original survey reports from 1990, showing the deposit's discovery, alongside the altered versions filed with the state. I've also included recent communications regarding the current operation targeting your property." "Why take this risk?" Becky pressed, needing to understand his motivation. "I'm retiring in 6 months, Reeves said simply. "I've spent nearly 3 decades watching NorthStar's practices become increasingly aggressive under Harrison's leadership. I don't want the final chapter of my career to include watching him steal your rightful resources using methods that should have been left in the past." As Becky drove back to Stone Creek, the USB drive secure in her pocket, her mind processed the implications of Reeves's revelations. The situation had evolved beyond negotiation over property value into something with moral and potentially legal dimensions that transcended simple business transaction. Her deliberation was interrupted by an urgent call from Maria. "Becky, there's a fire at the Hillcrest farmhouse. Fire department is responding." but the structure is fully engulfed. You need to get out there. Arriving at her property 30 minutes later, Becky found the farmhouse consumed by flames, despite the rural fire department's efforts to contain the blaze. Sheriff Daniels approached as Becky exited her truck, expression grim beneath his official composure. This wasn't accidental, the sheriff stated without preamble. Fire chief found evidence of accelerant around the perimeter. Someone wanted this place burned to the ground. As Becky watched the historical structure collapse in flames, the timing seemed too convenient to be coincidence. The dilapidated farmhouse had contained old records, photographs, and documents from her uncle's time. Potential evidence of the circumstances surrounding his departure, now reduced to ash. "I made digital copies of the most important documents," Becky said, more to herself than the sheriff. "But anything else that might have been hidden there is gone forever." This crosses a line from corporate pressure tactics to criminal activity, Daniels observed. "Arson investigation will be thorough, with state authorities involved given the circumstances." As emergency responders continued battling the fire, Becky's phone rang. Harrison Wells himself, calling directly for the first time since their confrontation on the property. "Ms. Mitchell, I've just been informed about the unfortunate fire at the farmhouse." Wells' voice carried practiced concern that didn't mask underlying tension. "Truly regrettable loss of historical structure. This emphasizes the vulnerability of isolated properties to unfortunate incidents." The implied threat beneath the superficial sympathy was unmistakable. "Are you calling to express condolences or deliver a message, Mr. Wells?" Becky asked, maintaining composure despite rising anger. "Merely to remind you that our offer expires tomorrow," Wells replied smoothly. "Given tonight's unfortunate development, perhaps reconsideration is appropriate. $5 million provides opportunity to start fresh without further complications." "I'll let you know my decision tomorrow," Becky responded, revealing nothing of her internal reaction to this thinly veiled intimidation. As she ended the call, Becky surveyed the burning remains of the farmhouse with newfound clarity. What had begun as unexpected inheritance had evolved into something approaching moral obligation. The property represented not just potential wealth, but opportunity to correct historical injustice perpetuated across generations. With resolute determination, Becky made 3 calls before leaving the property. First to Sarah, then to Diane Harper at the Attorney General's office, and finally to Thomas Reeves to confirm his willingness to testify. By morning, the pieces would be in place for a confrontation beyond anything Harrison Wells had anticipated when he first learned of Becky's inheritance. The next day dawned clear and cold, a Montana spring morning that promised warmth but delivered frost. Becky arrived at the NorthStar Mining headquarters in Boulder City 40 minutes before her scheduled meeting, taking time to collect her thoughts. In the shadow of the gleaming 20-story tower that dominated the small city's skyline. At precisely 9:20 a.m., Becky entered the lobby accompanied by Sarah Thompson, Diane Harper, and Thomas Reeves. The receptionist's professional smile faltered slightly at the unexpected entourage, but she promptly directed them to the executive floor where Harrison Wells would be waiting. The elevator ride to the top floor passed in tense silence, each occupant aware of the stakes involved in the confrontation to come. As the doors opened, they were greeted by Gregory Phillips, whose composed expression cracked momentarily at the sight of Thomas Reeves among the group. "Mr. Wells is expecting Ms. Mitchell," Phillips said, attempting to regain his equilibrium. "I wasn't aware she would be bringing colleagues." "They're integral to our discussion," Sarah replied, smoothly. "I believe the conference room will accommodate us all." Without waiting for response, Sarah led the group down the hallway toward the boardroom where, through glass walls, They could see Harrison Wells seated at the head of an impressive table, reviewing documents with Jennifer Walsh. Wells looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to calculating assessment as he registered the presence of not just Becky and her attorney, but a state prosecutor and his own longtime environmental manager. "Ms. Mitchell," he greeted, rising, with practiced courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "I see you've brought quite a delegation to what I understood was a private negotiation. This stopped being a simple negotiation the moment your company trespassed on my property and burned down my farmhouse," Becky replied calmly, placing a folder on the conference table. "We're here to discuss the terms of a very different arrangement than the one you've been proposing." Wells' expression hardened, though he maintained his composure. "I assure you, NorthStar had nothing to do with any fire. Such insinuations are not only false, but potentially actionable." "Like the insinuations your father made to my uncle in 1990? Becky asked. "About environmental violations that would be discovered if he didn't sell his farm." A brief flicker of uncertainty crossed Wells' face before his corporate mask returned. "I'm not familiar with the circumstances of that transaction from 3 decades ago. Blue Ridge Properties was the purchasing entity, as I recall, a shell company registered to your father, which transferred the property to Pinnacle Investments. A shell company registered to you," Diane Harper interjected. "After the existence of valuable minerals was deliberately concealed from both Frank Mitchell and state regulatory authorities." Wells' gaze shifted to Thomas Reeves, a dangerous edge entering his voice. "It seems my environmental manager has been sharing creative interpretations of ancient history." "Not interpretations, documentation," Reeves replied, sliding a folder across the table. "Original geological surveys showing the rare earth deposit alongside the altered versions filed with the state, plus recent communications regarding manufactured environmental emergencies and falsified county permits." The executive boardroom of NorthStar Mining fell silent as Thomas Reeves placed the complete geological survey report onto the polished conference table. "The actual value of the rare earth elements under Hillcrest Farm is over $112 million, not the $20 million you've been reporting to the board," Reeves stated firmly. "And I've provided copies of these findings, along with documentation of your systematic efforts to acquire these minerals through deception to both Ms. Mitchell and the State Attorney General's office." Harrison Wells' face drained of color as his longtime environmental manager continued, "This decades-long pattern of deception ends today." For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the ventilation system as Wells visibly calculated his options. His gaze moved from face to face, seeking weakness or uncertainty and finding none. "What exactly do you want?" he finally asked, addressing Becky directly. "Justice," she replied simply, "for my uncle and for myself. But I'm also practical enough to recognize that there's potential benefit for multiple parties if we approach this correctly." Sarah opened her briefcase and distributed documents to everyone present. "We're proposing a structured partnership for the responsible development of the Hillcrest mineral resources. NorthStar would provide the extraction expertise and technology, with profits divided based on actual mineral value rather than artificially depressed land purchase prices." Wells scanned the document, his expression unreadable. "This would delay our green technology initiative by months while new agreements are finalized." "Not necessarily," Becky countered. "The framework agreement could allow preliminary work to begin immediately, with final terms established while extraction infrastructure is developed. Your timeline remains intact, but the process becomes transparent and equitable." "And the alternative?" Wells asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Diane Harper spoke for the first time. The alternative is that the Attorney General's office files charges for multiple violations of state mineral rights laws, fraudulent permit applications, and corporate conspiracy spanning 3 decades. The investigation would naturally include a comprehensive review of all NorthStar properties acquired through similar means. The implied threat was clear. This case could open a Pandora's box of historical questionable practices that might threaten the entire foundation of NorthStar's mineral holdings. Wells was silent for a long moment, his legendary negotiating skill working to find leverage in a situation where he suddenly held few cards. "I need to discuss this with our board and legal team." "You have 24 hours, Sarah stated. "After that, we proceed with legal action regardless of potential partnership opportunities." As they rose to leave, Wells addressed Becky directly. "Your uncle was a stubborn man too. He regretted his resistance in the end." "My uncle regretted being forced from his home through deception and intimidation," Becky replied evenly. "I'm offering you a chance to build something better than what your father created. A business model based on partnership rather than exploitation. Whether you take that opportunity is entirely up to you." Outside the NorthStar Tower, Becky took her first deep breath since entering the building, the morning sun now high enough to warm her face as she looked up at the gleaming corporate headquarters. "Do you think he'll accept?" Sarah asked as they walked toward their vehicles. "He doesn't have much choice," Diane Harper replied. "The evidence is substantial enough to support criminal charges, not just civil penalties. Wells is nothing if not a survivor. He'll take the deal. The question is whether he'll honor it," Thomas Reeves added. 30 years with NorthStar has taught me that corporate culture comes from the top. Harrison has always seen regulations and agreements as obstacles to navigate rather than principles to uphold. That's why the partnership agreement includes independent oversight and transparent reporting requirements, Sarah assured him. "We've built in protections against the very tactics NorthStar has historically employed." As Becky drove back toward Riverdale, her mind processed the magnitude of what had transpired. The inheritance that had initially seemed like a burden now offered not just personal opportunity, but potential transformation for an entire community, historically at the mercy of corporate extraction interests. Her phone rang, Maria calling. "Here for an update." "It's done," Becky told her. "Wells didn't commit, but he will. The partnership agreement gives us everything we need. Fair value for the minerals, environmental protections, local hiring requirements, and transparency throughout the process." "And what about the fire?" Maria asked. "Just let that go." "Not exactly," Becky replied. "The arson investigation continues, but we've negotiated restoration of the farmhouse to its original condition as part of the agreement. If evidence eventually connects NorthStar to the fire, additional penalties would apply, but the rebuilding happens regardless." "You've changed the rules of the game," Maria observed with a note of admiration. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone dealing with NorthStar in the future." This observation crystallized something Becky had been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. Her inheritance had provided unexpected opportunity to address a power imbalance that had shaped her community for generations. The partnership model they'd proposed established a framework that recognized the rights and value of both resources and the people connected to them. The following afternoon, precisely 23 hours after their confrontation in the NorthStar boardroom, Harrison Wells's private number appeared on Becky's phone. "Ms. Mitchell," his voice carried the controlled precision of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "Our board has reviewed your partnership proposal, with certain modifications to the profit-sharing structure and extraction timeline. NorthStar is prepared to move forward." The negotiation that followed established the foundation for what would eventually become known throughout the industry as the Mitchell model, a framework for resource development that balanced corporate expertise with landowner rights and community benefit. 1 week later, the Riverdale Town Hall hosted the formal announcement of the Hillcrest Minerals Partnership with representatives from state agencies, environmental organizations, and local business leaders in attendance. The gathered crowd represented a community that had long existed in NorthStar's shadow, now witnessing unprecedented recognition of their value beyond simply providing land and labor for corporate extraction. As Becky addressed the assembled community, she found unexpected eloquence in expressing the principles that had guided her through the confrontation with NorthStar. This partnership represents more than fair value for minerals beneath one farm, she explained. It establishes that responsible resource development must recognize the worth of both what lies below the surface and the communities that exist above it. When extraction companies partner with landowners and communities rather than simply extracting from them, everyone benefits from more sustainable, transparent, and equitable outcomes. The audience's response reflected a community beginning to envision different possibilities for their relationship with the corporate entities that had historically held disproportionate power in determining regional economic outcomes. Harrison Wells, standing at the edge of the gathering rather than center stage, observed the proceedings with inscrutable expression. Whether he recognized the historical significance of this shift in approach or merely calculated its impact on quarterly profits remained unclear. What was certain was that the partnership established a precedent that would influence NorthStar's operations throughout the region in ways its founder could never have anticipated when first establishing the company's aggressive acquisition strategies decades earlier. As the formal presentations concluded and community members gathered in smaller conversations, Sheriff Daniels approached Becky with quiet observation. "Your uncle would be proud," he said simply. "He fought the same battle but didn't have the resources or support to win it. You finished what he started." This connection to her family's past resonated deeply with Becky, who had never anticipated that her inheritance would create opportunity to address historical injustice alongside personal opportunity. The worthless farm had provided leverage to transform not just her own circumstances, but potential interactions between corporations and communities throughout the region. That evening, as sunset painted the landscape in golden light, Becky stood on the eastern ridge of Hillcrest Farm, surveying the property that had changed not just her life, but her community's future trajectory. Construction crews had already begun preparations for both the extraction facility and the rebuilding of the farmhouse, according to historical photographs and local memory. What had begun as unexpected inheritance had evolved into something with impact extending far beyond anything she had imagined when first receiving notification of her uncle's will. The true value of her inheritance had never really been the millions of dollars beneath the surface, but the opportunity to demonstrate that even in business, approaches based on fairness and shared benefit could succeed where exploitation and concentration of wealth ultimately failed. Diane Harper had perhaps summarized it best during their final meeting before the announcement. "You've done something remarkable here, Ms. Mitchell. You've transformed potential personal fortune into community legacy. In doing so, you've not just reclaimed land your family lost. You've redefined what value really means." 4 years after Becky Mitchell inherited the worthless Hillcrest Farm, the property hosted the annual Riverdale Community Foundation celebration. Children played on the expansive green lawn that had once been barren soil, while families gathered beneath newly planted shade trees that bordered the restored farmhouse. In the distance, the discreet extraction facility operated with minimal disruption to the landscape, its modern architecture designed to complement rather than dominate the rural setting. At the center of it all stood Becky, now 42, watching with quiet satisfaction as this year's Mitchell Scholarship recipients shared their educational plans with community members who remembered when the name NorthStar had represented exploitation rather than opportunity. "Still can't believe the transformation," observed Sheriff Daniels, now retired but still a respected community figure. He stood beside Becky near the farmhouse porch that had been rebuilt using historical photographs as reference. 4 years ago, this place was abandoned land everyone avoided. Now it's bringing the whole county together. Amazing what's possible when resources benefit the community they come from, Becky replied, watching local high school graduates receive scholarship certificates that would fund their college education. Young people who previously would have needed to leave Riverdale to find economic opportunity. The transformation extended far beyond the physical restoration of Hillcrest Farm. The rare earth element extraction had indeed confirmed Jim Cooper's assessments, nearly 28,000 metric tons of high-quality material extracted with innovative techniques that minimized environmental impact while maximizing recovery. But the distribution of that wealth had created impact more profound than mere financial metrics could capture. Under Board Chairman Anthony Davis's leadership, NorthStar Mining had embraced the partnership model pioneered at Hillcrest, implementing similar approaches across multiple projects throughout the region. The company's corporate culture had transformed from aggressive acquisition toward collaborative development, creating unexpected competitive advantage through improved community relations and reduced regulatory friction. The Community Foundation, established through the partnership, had distributed over $18 million toward educational programs, infrastructure development, and economic diversification initiatives that benefited even the most vulnerable residents. Scholarships enabled rural students to pursue higher education without crippling debt. Small business grants created economic opportunities beyond resource extraction. And environmental restoration projects healed decades of industrial damage while creating sustainable infrastructure for future generations. Most remarkably, the model had spread beyond Riverdale, with mining companies throughout the state implementing variations of the Mitchell Partnership approach. The Riverdale model, as industry publications had labeled it, was transforming corporate practices that had remained unchanged for decades. Proof that ethical business approaches could create competitive advantage alongside community benefit. As Becky moved through the celebration, greeting neighbors and partnership stakeholders, she spotted Jim Cooper speaking with a group of scholarship recipients near the geological displays that explained the rare earth element's significance. The geologist had proven crucial in understanding the property's potential and had since become director of the partnership's educational initiatives. These students are developing monitoring techniques that could revolutionize extraction safety, he reported as Becky joined them. Their research project is already attracting attention from regulatory agencies and industry partners. The students, children of miners and service workers who might never have accessed higher education without the partnership scholarships, explained their innovations with confidence, born from knowing their ideas were taken seriously regardless of their backgrounds. Their project exemplified the partnership's core philosophy that community prosperity required investment in human potential alongside responsible resource development. Any word from Westridge Mining about adopting these monitoring protocols? Becky asked, referring to NorthStar's regional competitor that had initially approached her about licensing the partnership model. Their new environmental director is reviewing the proposal, Jim confirmed. Maria's meeting with them next week to discuss implementation timeline. Maria Diaz had evolved from skeptical farm manager to passionate advocate for the partnership model, now serving as Chief Operations Officer, while overseeing both the original Stone Creek Farm and community relations across partnership projects. Her practical expertise and unwavering integrity had made her a respected voice throughout the industry. Proof that agricultural and extraction interests could align when approached through collaborative rather than competitive frameworks. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the community celebration transitioned to a formal recognition program held on the farmhouse lawn. Local officials, industry representatives, and community members assembled to honor particularly impactful initiatives developed through the partnership over the previous year. When Becky took the podium to present the annual Community Impact Award, an unexpected figure at the back of the gathering caught her attention. Harrison Wells himself, observing the proceedings with unreadable expression. The former NorthStar CEO had not returned to Riverdale since stepping down 2 years earlier, his presence creating a ripple of surprised whispers among those who recognized him. Becky acknowledged the unexpected visitor with brief nod before continuing her presentation, highlighting the remarkable achievements of a rural health initiative that had expanded medical services throughout the county. Funded through partnership resources, the project exemplified how mineral wealth was creating sustainable infrastructure beyond traditional extraction industry boundaries, addressing community needs that had remained unmet for generations. As formal presentations concluded and attendees enjoyed dinner prepared by local restaurants, supported through partnership small business grants, Harrison Wells approached Becky with the measured caution of someone uncertain of his reception. "Impressive transformation," the former CEO observed, gesturing toward the thriving community gathering, "hardly recognizable as the same property. People can accomplish remarkable things when given proper resources and respect," Becky replied neutrally, studying the man whose company had shaped the region's history through very different approaches than what the celebration represented. Wells had aged visibly in the 4 years since their confrontation in the NorthStar boardroom, though still carrying himself with inherited confidence. Something in his bearing suggested diminished certainty, a man whose fundamental assumptions had been challenged by outcomes he hadn't anticipated. "My consulting firm has been studying your partnership model," he acknowledged, surprising Becky with this unexpected disclosure. "Several clients are implementing variations of your profit-sharing structure and community foundation approach. The results are proving instructive." The admission represented remarkable evolution from the man who had once dismissed community benefit as irrelevant to corporate objectives. "The model works because it acknowledges interdependence rather than exploitation," Becky observed. "Something your father's generation of business leaders never fully recognized." Wells's expression revealed complex reaction to this reference to his family legacy. "I've been researching my father's business practices, particularly regarding the original Mitchell property acquisition," he said, after brief hesitation. "The documented manipulation of your uncle's financial situation during that period. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was apparently standard practice." This acknowledgement of historical injustice from the man whose family had perpetrated it created momentary speechlessness for Becky. "What prompted that research?" she finally asked. "Anthony Davis insisted on full historical audit when he assumed permanent CEO position," Wells replied. "The findings were enlightening regarding the true foundations of what I had always considered exemplary business empire." Before Becky could respond to this unexpected revelation, they were joined by Elena Vasquez, the current chair of the Community Foundation Board and granddaughter of a rancher who had lost land to NorthStar's aggressive tactics during the same period that had claimed Frank Mitchell's property. "Mr. Wells," she acknowledged with professional courtesy that couldn't entirely mask historical awareness, "your visit is unexpected." "I'm here in research capacity," he explained, documenting the partnership model for case study on alternative development approaches. Eleanor's expression reflected polite skepticism. Interesting focus given your historical approach to resource development. Perhaps because of that history, Wells replied with surprising candor. Success creates responsibility to understand practices that prove more effective than one's own approaches. This acknowledgement of the partnership's success from the man who had most aggressively opposed its creation represented significant evolution beyond corporate defensiveness. The conversation that followed revealed Wells's apparent transformation from exploitation-focused executive to analyst of collaborative development models, though whether driven by genuine ethical reconsideration or mere pragmatic adaptation remained unclear. As Wells departed with research materials provided by the Foundation staff, Eleanor observed, 4 years ago, he was threatening your property and burning down your farmhouse to protect corporate interests. Now he's studying your model as best practice example. That's either remarkable transformation or sophisticated co-option strategy. Perhaps both, Becky acknowledged. But either way, the partnership model is reshaping practices his family, established over generations. That's meaningful progress, regardless of his personal motivations. Ben, as evening deepened and celebration continued with music and dancing beneath strings of lights hung from the restored barn, Becky found quiet moment with Maria near the memorial garden, established to honor community members who hadn't lived. To see the region's transformation, among the commemorative plantings stood simple stone marker for Frank Mitchell, Becky's uncle, whose unexpected bequest had created the opportunity for change. Your uncle would be amazed by what you've accomplished, Maria observed, knowing how the inheritance had initially seemed more burden than opportunity. He always said this land held value beyond what others could see, Becky replied, though I doubt even he imagined anything like this. That this encompassed far more than the physical transformation of once abandoned farm into thriving community center. It included scholarship recipients who would become first college graduates in their families, small business owners who had established sustainable enterprises through partnership grants, and environmental restoration projects that had healed decades of industrial damage throughout the region. Most significantly, it included fundamental shift in power dynamics that had governed the community for generations. Where corporations had once extracted resources while concentrating wealth among small ownership class, the partnership model ensured prosperity reached community members through education, healthcare, and economic opportunity that transcended traditional class boundaries. The celebration continued late into the evening, community members of all backgrounds sharing meals, conversations, and dances in celebration that reflected more than mere economic success. What they commemorated was the community itself, its resilience, interdependence, and capacity for transformation when resources were distributed with justice rather than concentrated through exploitation. The following morning found Becky at her Stone Creek farm reviewing operations with the management team that had expanded as the partnership's success created resources for agricultural innovation alongside mineral extraction. The integration of sustainable farming practices with responsible resource development represented physical manifestation of the partnership's core philosophy that prosperity required balance rather than extraction across all resource categories. Sarah Thompson arrived for their scheduled meeting regarding expansion of the partnership model to neighboring Powell County, where similar community foundation was being established. The attorney's practice had evolved alongside the partnership, focusing on implementing collaborative development structures that balanced corporate interests with community benefit across multiple industries. The Powell County Commissioners approved the foundation charter yesterday, Sarah reported as they settled in Becky's office. They're eager to implement the partnership approach for the new copper development on their western border. Copper rather than rare earth elements, Becky noted with satisfaction. Further proof, the model transcends specific resources. The core principles apply regardless of resource type. Sarah agreed. Shared prosperity, environmental responsibility, and community governance create sustainable outcomes across sectors. Their discussion of implementation details was interrupted by unexpected visitor Thomas Reeves, whose courageous testimony in the NorthStar boardroom had proven crucial to establishing the partnership 4 years earlier. The environmental manager had departed the company alongside Harrison Wells, though in dramatically different circumstances and with considerably more respect from colleagues and community alike. "Sorry to interrupt," Reeves apologized from the doorway, "but I thought you should see this immediately." He placed industry newsletter on Becky's desk, open to business section featuring prominent headline, "Wells releases comprehensive study of Mitchell partnership model. Acknowledges transformative impact on extraction industry practices." The article detailed 50-page analysis Harrison Wells had published through prestigious business journal, documenting the Hillcrest Partnership's operational structure, profit distribution mechanisms, and governance frameworks with unexpected objectivity. Most remarkably, the study acknowledged superior outcomes of partnership approach compared to traditional corporate models across multiple metrics, including profitability, environmental compliance, and community benefit. "He actually analyzed the data objectively," Reeves observed with evident surprise. "There's no spin or corporate defensiveness, just straightforward acknowledgement that the partnership model outperforms traditional approaches on virtually every meaningful metric." Becky scanned the article, equally surprised by Wells's apparent intellectual honesty regarding model that had directly challenged his family's multi-generational approach to business. The concluding quote seemed particularly significant. "The Mitchell partnership represents paradigm shift in resource development by demonstrating that shared prosperity creates sustainable advantage compared to concentrated profit models." The implications extend beyond extraction sector to fundamental reconsideration of corporate community relationships across all industries. Remarkable evolution from man who once called community benefit irrelevant distraction from core business objectives, Sarah observed, though I notice he never directly acknowledges his own opposition to the model's implementation or his family's historical exploitation of the communities now benefiting from the partnership. "The analysis is technically honest without being personally accountable," Reeves added, "still represents significant progress. 4 years ago, he was willing to commit arson to prevent the model from being implemented. Now he's documenting its success for business audiences who might never otherwise consider alternative approaches." The publication indeed represented an important milestone in the partnership's influence beyond regional boundaries. Wells' analysis would reach corporate audiences typically insulated from community-centered development models, potentially accelerating adoption of collaborative approaches throughout industries traditionally resistant to such frameworks. Later, that afternoon, Diane Harper visited the farm to discuss the study's implications for ongoing regulatory reforms her office was promoting at state level. The prosecutor had leveraged the partnership's success to advocate for statutory changes that incentivize community benefit structures across multiple industries, creating systemic transformation beyond what individual corporate practices could achieve. Wells' study adds credibility beyond what our regulatory advocacy alone could accomplish, Diane acknowledged. When former CEO known for aggressive profit maximization documents superior outcomes from community partnership model, even the most resistant legislators take notice. "Has he reached out to your office regarding the historical documents we uncovered during the initial investigation?" Becky asked, curious whether Wells's apparent evolution extended to accountability for his family's past actions. "Not directly," Diane replied, "though he hasn't opposed our efforts to create restitution framework for families affected by his father's predatory acquisition practices. His silence represents tacit acceptance, if not explicit accountability." The conversation shifted toward upcoming legislative session, where statutory changes would be considered to formalize community partnership structures within state business codes, creating legal framework that incentivized collaborative approaches through tax benefits, regulatory streamlining, and priority access to development resources, typically reserved for traditional corporate entities. The Mitchell model is becoming legal template for next-generation business structures, Diane explained. What began as resolution to specific property dispute is evolving into statutory framework that could transform development practices statewide. Higher, this expansion from individual project to systemic reform represented fulfillment of vision that had gradually evolved from Becky's initial inheritance. What had begun as unexpected acquisition of seemingly worthless property had transformed first into community partnership, then regional development model, and now potential statutory framework with implications extending far beyond Riverdale or even mineral extraction industry specifically. The following week brought announcement that NorthStar Mining, under Anthony Davis's leadership, would be converting all its Montana operations to partnership model over a 3-year period. The company's stock had reached record highs as investors recognized the business advantages of reduced regulatory friction, community support, and talent retention that partnership structures facilitated compared to traditional extraction approaches. Even more significantly, 3 major international resource companies had announced pilot programs based on the Mitchell model, suggesting potential global impact for governance structure that had originated in small Montana community. The rapid adoption confirmed what partnership advocates had long argued, that ethical business practices could create competitive advantage when implemented systematically rather than a superficial public relations exercise. As summer progressed, toward harvest season, Becky divided her time between Stone Creek Farm's agricultural operations and expanding partnership initiatives that continued transforming regional economic landscape. The balance reflected her personal philosophy that true prosperity required nurturing multiple resources simultaneously rather than exploiting single opportunity at expense of broader ecosystem. During rare quiet evening at Hillcrest, Becky sat on farmhouse porch watching sunset paint dramatic colors across the western sky. The beauty and tranquility contrasted sharply with property's condition when she'd first inherited it. Dilapidated, abandoned, considered worthless by everyone except NorthStar Mining, which had recognized what lay beneath the surface. Her reflections were interrupted by arrival of Jim Cooper, who joined her on the porch with folder containing latest analysis from Geological Survey team monitoring the extraction operation. "We've identified new formation extending beneath Powell County border," Jim explained, spreading maps across the small table between their chairs. "Preliminary testing suggests additional rare earth concentrations potentially exceeding original Hillcrest deposit. Nay, the discovery represented potential expansion of partnership's impact, creating opportunity to implement proven governance model from inception rather than retrofitting existing operation. More importantly, it offered chance to demonstrate that partnership approach could manage growth and expansion with same ethical foundation that had guided initial development. "Have you shared this with NorthStar yet?" Becky asked, studying the geological formations with practiced eye developed through years of partnership involvement. "Anthony wants to meet tomorrow," Jim confirmed. "He's proposing joint development." a cross-county line with expanded community foundation covering both jurisdictions. Completely different approach than Harrison would have taken. This evolution in corporate strategy represented perhaps the most significant validation of partnership model, transformation not just in outcomes, but in fundamental decision-making. Processes that determined how resource opportunities were approached from earliest identification. Remember when everyone called Hillcrest worthless? Becky mused, watching final rays of sunlight illuminate distant mountains. Turns out its greatest value wasn't even the minerals. It was the opportunity to demonstrate better way to develop them. The Mitchell model, Jim nodded, changing how companies approach community resources across the entire sector. Their conversation was interrupted by sounds of vehicles approaching. Several cars carrying scholarship committee members arriving for scheduled evening meeting to review next year's applications. Becky rose to welcome them, transitioning smoothly from reflection to action, embodying the balanced leadership that had become characteristic of partnership governance. As committee members settled in farmhouse dining room, converted to meeting space, Becky observed how naturally diverse community voices had integrated into decision-making processes previously dominated by corporate interests alone. The committee included former NorthStar employees, local educators, healthcare workers and business owners, stakeholders whose perspectives shaped resource allocation decisions with first-hand understanding of community needs. Structured collaboration between sectors that had once operated in isolation or opposition had become defining characteristic of partnership success. The shared authority created outcomes that balanced immediate economic benefits with long-term community development, producing prosperity measured not just in quarterly profits, but in generational opportunity. By evening's end, the committee had identified 28 scholarship recipients who would receive educational funding for coming academic year. Students whose future contributions would extend partnership impact far beyond mineral extraction timeline. This investment in human potential alongside resource development represented fundamental philosophical difference between partnership model and traditional corporate approaches focused solely on material extraction. Driving back to Stone Creek, under star-filled Montana sky, Becky reflected on transformation her unexpected inheritance had initiated. The worthless farm had indeed contained valuable minerals, but its true significance lay in opportunity to demonstrate that resource. Development could benefit communities through shared governance rather than concentrate wealth through exploitation. Most remarkably, the model was proving more profitable for all stakeholders than traditional approaches, creating business case for ethical practice that was reshaping corporate behavior throughout extraction industry. What had begun as principled stand against historical injustice had evolved into practical template for sustainable development, with implications extending far beyond single property or community. The following day brought invitation to present partnership model at International Sustainable Development Conference. Opportunity to share Riverdale's experience with stakeholders from communities throughout world facing similar challenges, balancing resource extraction with community benefit. The presentation would allow Becky to extend partnership impact by providing practical template others could adapt to local conditions and needs. While preparing materials for presentation, Becky revisited partnership's origin documents, including newspaper clipping announcing her inheritance of worthless farm that had transformed not just her life, but entire community's trajectory. The contrast between initial dismissive assessment and property's ultimate impact illustrated essential lesson partnership had demonstrated that true value emerges when resources are developed with respect for all stakeholders rather than exploited for benefit of few. 5 years after receiving unexpected notification that she had inherited her uncle's abandoned property, Becky stood before international audience of community leaders, corporate executives, and policymakers, sharing story that had begun with seemingly worthless farm and evolved into governance model transforming relationship between communities and resource development worldwide. The mineral wealth beneath Hillcrest Farm could have been extracted through traditional corporate approach, she explained to attentive audience. But that would have created temporary profits for distant shareholders while leaving local community with limited benefit and long-term environmental management challenges. She gestured towards slides showing partnership's multifaceted impact across education, healthcare, small business development, and environmental restoration. By developing those resources through partnership model that recognized rights and needs of all stakeholders, we created prosperity that extends far beyond extraction timeline and distributes benefits throughout community that hosts these resources. Most compelling evidence came from NorthStar Mining's own financial reports, which documented increased profitability alongside reduced regulatory friction and litigation costs. The business case for ethical practice had proven as significant as moral arguments in accelerating adoption across industry previously resistant to community-centered approaches. Partnership governance isn't just right thing to do, Becky concluded. It's smarter business strategy that creates sustainable advantage compared to exploitative approaches. When communities benefit alongside corporations, they become allies, rather than adversaries in resource development process. As international participants approached with questions after presentation, Becky recognized that Hillcrest's transformation from worthless property to catalyst for global change represented something her uncle had always believed. That land holds value far beyond what appears on surface, requiring wisdom and patience to develop properly. Perhaps most significant validation came 6 months later when Harrison Wells published comprehensive case study documenting partnership models, economic advantages compared to traditional extraction approaches. The analysis, co-authored with leading business school professors, established empirical evidence supporting ethical resource development as business strategy rather than merely moral choice. Wells never explicitly acknowledged his personal resistance to models' implementation or his family's historical exploitation of communities now benefiting from partnership approach. Yet his intellectual honesty in documenting superior outcomes represented important step toward accountability from industry leader whose practices had shaped resource development throughout region for generations. 7 years after Becky's inheritance, Hillcrest Farm hosted graduation ceremony for first cohort of students who had completed entire educational journey through Partnership Scholarship Program. These young professionals, many first in their families to attend college, represented living embodiment of partnership's multi-generational impact beyond immediate economic benefits from mineral extraction. As community gathered to celebrate these graduates' achievements, conversation naturally turned toward partnership's transformation of regional economic landscape. Where extraction had once created boom-bust cycles that left communities vulnerable to corporate decisions beyond their control, partnership model had established sustainable development approach that diversified opportunity while distributing benefits more equitably. The mineral resources that had initiated partnership would eventually be depleted, but educational investments, infrastructure development, and diversified economic opportunities would continue generating community benefit long after extraction concluded. This extension beyond resource timeline represented perhaps most significant contrast with traditional corporate approaches focused on maximizing short-term extraction while minimizing community investment. Standing beneath shade of trees planted during partnership's first year, Becky observed celebration with quiet satisfaction that transcended personal accomplishment. The worthless farm had indeed contained valuable minerals, but its true significance lay in opportunity to demonstrate that prosperity requires shared governance rather than concentrated control of resources that sustain community life. What had begun as unexpected inheritance had evolved into governance model with global implications, proving that development approaches recognizing interdependence between corporations and communities create sustainable advantage compared to exploitation. Strategies that extract resources without distributing benefits to those most affected by their removal. As graduation celebration transitioned into community gathering, extending into evening, shared sense of ownership and accomplishment transcended traditional boundaries between corporate and community interests. The partnership had created prosperity, measured not merely in extracted resources, but in human potential developed alongside material wealth, achievement that would continue generating returns long after minerals were depleted. In a world increasingly recognizing limits of extraction without reciprocity, the Mitchell partnership model offered practical template for development that honored both business requirements and community needs. What had once been dismissed as worthless land had demonstrated that true value emerges when resources are developed with respect for all stakeholders whose lives they touch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Hillcrest Farm as Becky Mitchell stood at the edge of the eastern ridge, watching workers install the final section of the state-of-the-art extraction facility. 7 years had passed since she'd inherited this worthless patch of Montana soil. 7 years that had transformed not just the land, but the entire community surrounding it. "Hard to believe this all started with a $500 inheritance tax bill," said Maria, now operations director for the Mitchell Community Partnership, as she joined Becky at the Overlook. Becky nodded, remembering the day County Clerk Harold Jenkins had handed her the keys with thinly veiled pity. Nobody thought this land was worth the property taxes. Now look at it. Below them, the extraction facility blended harmoniously with the restored landscape. Unlike traditional mining operations that scarred the earth, this facility had been designed to minimize environmental impact while maximizing the efficient recovery of the rare earth elements that had changed everything. The facility employed over 60 local residents, most of whom had received specialized training funded through the partnership's education initiative. Beyond the extraction zone, the renovated farmhouse served as headquarters for the community foundation that managed the partnership between NorthStar Mining and the residents of Riverdale County. The once dilapidated barns had been reconstructed as educational spaces where visitors from around the world came to learn about the Mitchell model of resource development that had rapidly gained international attention. "The Japanese delegation arrives tomorrow," Maria reminded her. "Their government is considering legislation based on our framework for their own rare earth development. Make sure they see the whole operation, not just the extraction facility," Becky replied. "They need to understand this isn't just about mining technology. It's about governance structure." The Mitchell model had revolutionized thinking about resource development by establishing a partnership that distributed benefits throughout the community while ensuring environmental responsibility and corporate profitability. The approach had been so successful that Anthony Davis, who had replaced Harrison Wells as CEO of NorthStar Mining 3 years earlier, was implementing similar structures across all the company's operations. As Becky and Maria walked back toward the main complex, they passed the community garden, where local high school students were conducting soil remediation experiments under the guidance of university researchers. The partnership's educational programs had transformed Riverdale High School from an underfunded rural school with declining enrollment to a specialized science academy drawing students from throughout the state. "Mrs. Grayson called this morning," Maria said, referring to the school principal. 2 more seniors just received full scholarships to Montana State's geology program. That makes 7 this year. Becky smiled, thinking of how different these students' futures looked compared to the limited opportunities available before the partnership. The scholarships, funded through the Community Foundation's Educational Trust, would create a new generation of scientists with deep understanding of both technical expertise and ethical responsibility. Inside the partnership's headquarters, Sarah Thompson was meeting with representatives from neighboring Powell County, where another mineral deposit had recently been discovered. The attorney's practice had evolved to specialize in implementing variations of the Mitchell model across different contexts, helping communities negotiate balanced agreements with resource companies rather than accepting traditional extraction relationships. The key difference in Powell County is water rights, Sarah was explaining as Becky entered. The watershed implications require adaptations to the oversight structure, but the core principles remain the same: shared prosperity, sustainable practices, and transparent governance. This process of adaptation and evolution had become central to the Mitchell model's success. Rather than imposing a rigid framework, the approach established foundational principles that could be customized to address specific local conditions and priorities. This flexibility had enabled implementation across diverse contexts while maintaining essential commitments to balanced development. After the meeting concluded, Becky and Sarah reviewed preparations for the following week's Community Foundation board meeting, where decisions would be made regarding the next phase of investment in local infrastructure. The foundation, funded through a percentage of extraction revenue, had already transformed Riverdale's downtown, restored the watershed damaged by historical mining operations, and established a rural healthcare network that served the region's most vulnerable residents. The hospital expansion proposal needs more work, Sarah noted. The capital costs make sense, but the operational budget doesn't account for specialized staff recruitment challenges in rural settings. This attention to practical implementation details rather than merely aspirational goals had distinguished the Mitchell model from traditional corporate social responsibility initiatives. The partnership's success stemmed from rigorous commitment to measurable outcomes and sustainable operations, creating durable institutions rather than temporary programs dependent on continuing corporate goodwill. Later that afternoon, Becky drove to the nearby university research station that had been established through partnership funding. Dr. Jim Cooper, now director of the Sustainable Resource Development Institute, had expanded from his initial geological assessment of Hillcrest Farm to lead an international research program examining balanced approaches to critical mineral extraction worldwide. "Perfect timing," Jim greeted her, gesturing toward a video conference screen where researchers from 3 continents were sharing findings on adaptations of the Mitchell model to diverse geological and social contexts. "We were just discussing the Namibian implementation. The preliminary results show significant improvements in both community benefit distribution and extraction efficiency compared to traditional approaches." These documented outcomes from multiple implementations had gradually transformed the Mitchell model from idealistic experiment to evidence-based practice. The empirical data showing improved results for both community and corporate stakeholders had proven more persuasive in driving adoption than moral arguments alone could have achieved. As Becky participated in the research discussion, she was struck by how far the impact had spread from her initial inheritance. What had begun as personal determination to understand the value of her uncle's seemingly worthless property had evolved into governance framework being implemented across continents and resource categories. "The Australian team is reporting interesting adaptations regarding indigenous authority structures," noted a researcher from Singapore. They've integrated traditional decision-making processes with partnership governance in ways that strengthen both systems. This continuous evolution through implementation in diverse contexts represented the partnership model's most significant strength. Rather than promoting standardized solution, the approach encouraged adaptation to local conditions while maintaining core commitments to shared prosperity, environmental responsibility, and transparent governance. The sun was setting as Becky drove back to her original farm in Stone Creek, where she still maintained agricultural operations alongside her partnership responsibilities. The balanced commitment to both farming and mineral development reflected her personal philosophy that true prosperity required nurturing multiple resources simultaneously, rather than exploiting single opportunity at expense of broader ecosystem. At the farm entrance, she found an unexpected visitor waiting, Harrison Wells, the former CEO of NorthStar Mining, whose aggressive tactics had created the initial conflict over Hillcrest Farm. Now retired, Wells had published influential analysis of the Mitchell model that had helped accelerate its adoption throughout the extraction industry. Ms. Mitchell, he greeted her with the formal courtesy that had replaced their earlier antagonism. I hope this isn't an intrusion. I wanted to share something with you before it's publicly announced. Wells had aged visibly since stepping down from NorthStar, though he still carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. The years had softened but not erased the tension between them, their relationship evolving from direct opposition to wary mutual respect. The Wells Foundation is establishing an endowed chair at Montana State focusing on ethical resource governance, he explained, handing her formal announcement. We'd like to name it in honor of your uncle, Frank Mitchell. His stand against my father's practices deserves recognition, even if it comes decades too late. And this unexpected gesture represented remarkable evolution from man who had once threatened Becky's property and attempted to acquire her inheritance for a fraction of its true value. Whether driven by genuine ethical reconsideration or pragmatic adaptation to changing industry standards remained unclear, but the practical impact of his influence on corporate practices was undeniable. Frank would have appreciated the irony, Becky replied with measured acceptance of the gesture. He always believed this land held value beyond what others could see. Their conversation continued briefly, touching on implementation challenges, facing companies adapting to partnership governance after generations of traditional extraction approaches. Despite their different perspectives, both recognized that industry transformation required both principled vision and practical expertise in navigating complex operational realities. As Wells departed, Becky reflected on a journey that had brought them from bitter adversaries to reluctant participants in dialogue about resource development's future. The relationship exemplified broader transformation the Mitchell model had catalyzed throughout extraction sector, gradually shifting deeply entrenched practices through demonstrated advantages rather than merely moral arguments. The following morning brought news that further validated the partnership approach. The state legislature had passed the Responsible Resource Development Act, establishing regulatory framework that incorporated key partnership principles into governance requirements for all new extraction projects. The legislation represented evolution from voluntary corporate initiative to institutionalized public policy, creating structured incentives for balanced development approaches. This fundamentally changes the dynamics for all future resource projects, Sarah explained during their morning call discussing the legislation's implications. Rather than communities fighting defensive battles against extraction impacts, they'll have legal framework supporting balanced development from the beginning. This policy transformation reflected partnership models' expanded influence beyond individual corporate or community decisions to broader governance systems shaping resource development throughout the region. The legislative framework would extend balanced development principles to contexts where voluntary adoption might have been slower or less comprehensive. That afternoon, Becky led Community Foundation board meeting, where final approval was granted for next phase of local investment. Initiatives. The diverse board, including former NorthStar employees, local business owners, educators, and healthcare workers, had evolved into effective governance body, ensuring partnership benefits addressed actual community priorities rather than merely corporate assumptions about local needs. The technical training program expansion makes strategic sense, noted Eleanor Vasquez, now serving as board chair after years of community organizing experience. With critical mineral development accelerating throughout the region, our residents will have competitive advantage in the job market if we invest in these specialized skills. The meeting demonstrated partnership governance in action, collaborative decision-making that balanced immediate needs with long-term development vision, creating sustainable prosperity rather than temporary benefits dependent on continued extraction. This governance capacity represented perhaps partnership's most significant achievement, establishing community institutions capable of managing development challenges far beyond initial mineral project. As day concluded, Becky received unexpected email from Thomas Reeves, the former NorthStar environmental manager whose courageous testimony had proven crucial in establishing the original partnership. Now serving as consultant for international development organizations, Reeves had been implementing adapted versions of the Mitchell model in regions facing complex resource governance challenges. Just returned from consultation in mining region experiencing violent conflict over resource control, he wrote. Introduced partnership principles as framework for transforming competition into collaboration. For the first time in years, all stakeholders remained at negotiating table for entire week. First step toward implementing governance structure that addresses underlying causes rather than merely symptoms. This application to conflict transformation represented partnership's most challenging and potentially significant adaptation, moving beyond economic development to address fundamental security and governance failures in regions where resource extraction had historically exacerbated rather than alleviated community vulnerability. The possibility highlighted partnership's evolution from localized solution to governance framework with potential global implications. As Becky prepared for next day's visit from international delegation, she reviewed documentation summarizing partnership's impact over 7 years since her inheritance of seemingly worthless farm. The quantitative metrics were impressive. Millions in community investment, hundreds of educational opportunities created, significant environmental restoration achieved alongside profitable extraction operation. But the qualitative transformation proved even more meaningful, shift from antagonistic relationship between corporation and community toward collaborative development, addressing shared priorities. The core insight that had emerged through partnerships implementation across diverse contexts was surprisingly simple but profoundly transformative. Prosperity isn't zero-sum competition between corporate and community interests, but emerges most powerfully through governance, recognizing their fundamental interdependence. This principle, when structured into practical decision-making frameworks and accountability mechanisms, consistently produced superior outcomes compared to traditional extraction approaches focusing exclusively on operational efficiency while externalizing social and environmental costs. In a world increasingly recognizing limits of extraction without reciprocity, the Mitchell model offered practical template for development that honored both business requirements and community needs. What had once been dismissed as worthless land had demonstrated that true value emerges when resources are developed with respect for all stakeholders whose lives they touch. principle proven through implementation to create advantages for corporations and communities alike. The worthless farm had indeed contained valuable minerals, but its enduring significance lay in governance innovation that continued generating returns through application across diverse contexts long after physical resources were depleted. From unexpected inheritance had emerged renewable asset in form of governance framework, helping communities worldwide transform resource potential into sustainable prosperity through shared rather than concentrated benefit. As Becky finalized presentation for international delegation, she included quote from her uncle that had gained new meaning through partnership's evolution. "This land speaks if you know how to listen." The minerals beneath Hillcrest Farm had indeed proven valuable beyond anyone's expectations, but their true worth lay in opportunity they provided to demonstrate development approach, balancing prosperity, responsibility, and community benefit model. Now helping regions worldwide hear what their own lands had been trying to tell them all along. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.